Honorable Professor Goodwin, dear audience, I am Simo Grönroosin and I welcome you all to this event on immigration and its effects on Western societies, organized by Suomen Perusta think tank with our main guest, British professor, political commentator and Reform Party figure Matt Goodwin. Welcome to you. Professor Goodwin has for years closely followed questions related to immigration, national populism and woke politics, and he has written numerous books and articles on these topics. A British think tank, Prosperity Institute, recently published a population forecast prepared by Professor Goodwin, projecting the development of different population groups over the next 100 years in the United Kingdom. And the forecast doesn't look good for the position of the native British population, who are becoming a minority in their home country, area by area, because of the rapid growth of immigration. Suomen Perusta, for its part, published a year ago a book titled A Minority in One's Own Country, vähemmistöksi omassa maassaan, which likewise examines the development of immigration and the effects of the growth of immigrant population on society and on the rights of the native population. Today we will begin with a short overview by myself on the demographic development brought by immigration from a Finnish perspective, followed by Professor Goodwin's lecture on Britain's immigration situation, a warning example of where Finland too is heading. Dear audience, population replacement, demographic change, demographic shift. You can call the situation produced by high immigration and low birth rate of a native population by any name. It is a real phenomenon, one by which our time will be remembered in the history books if nothing is done about it. This is a real phenomenon, despite the fact that in the public debate the matter is often swept under the rug by dismissing it as a conspiracy theory. In Finland, we have once again seen this in the past days when both Riikka Purra, chair of the Finns Party, and vice chair Teemu Keskisarja have been attacked in the media for raising these demographic facts about immigration. Population changes caused by migration are nothing new under the sun. Peoples have been replaced throughout history by migration, but the essential point is this: such change is never positive for the people who become minorities in their traditional homelands. Or did European settlers enrich the cultures of Native Americans? Did the influx of Russians during the Soviet era enrich Estonian identity? Or does the flood of Han Chinese today enrich the identity of people of occupied Tibet? Migration into Europe from the Third World is comparable to these historical population shifts, such as the Native Americans becoming a minority in their own continent. Today, however, the pace is even faster as modern technology enables the mass movement of people more easily. Population replacement is not a conspiracy theory, but a coldly logical consequence of immigration policy choices. In history, peoples often disappeared under force, but in modern Western countries, demographic change is occurring even though the native populations could, if they chose, stop the development with the political decisions. Europe is full of examples of demographic change. To illustrate this, just few figures. Only 54% of school children in Sweden now speak only Swedish at home. In Germany, 28% of the population had a foreign background in 2022, and among those under 6 years, figure was already 41%. In France, 1/3 of the population under 60 has an immigrant background. Forecasts have also been made projecting these demographic changes into the future. Professor Goodwin's forecast for the Prosperity Institute gave a chilling assessment that the native population of the UK will become a minority in their own country by the year 2063, less than 40 years from now. What then does the development look like in Finland? Immigration to Finland began later than many other countries, but the numbers have grown rapidly. Just over 10 years ago, in 2014, the number of people with an immigrant background rose to 300,000, surpassing the Swedish-speaking population. In last decade, the immigrant background population has doubled, now standing over 600,000. Each year, tens of thousands of new immigrants arrive to Finland. Last year, the number of foreign language speakers increased by 52,000, while the number of native language speakers fell by 20,000. If that is not a population replacement, what is? Nationally, the immigrant background population has already risen above 10% of the total population, and regionally the situation is even starker. In Helsinki, 20% of the population has an immigrant background. In Espoo, already 1 in 4, and in Vantaa the figure is approaching 30%. The number of foreign background residents has therefore doubled in the last decade, and at this pace will double again in the next decade to well over 1 million. It is also clear that Finns will become a minority in cities like Espoo and Vantaa within a couple of decades. Traditionally, Russians and Estonians have been the largest immigrant groups, but Arabic is soon set to overtake Estonian as Finland's second largest foreign language, as the difference in the numbers of speakers is now only a few thousand. Finland, then, is following the footsteps of Britain and Western Europe, albeit starting later. According to the calculations of Kyösti Tarvainen, who has long studied demographic trends, the native populations of Nordic countries will become minorities during this century, and Finns will in fact be the first. So why is this madness happening? Immigration is often claimed to be necessary because the population is aging and the dependency ratio is worsening. In reality, however, only a small fraction of immigrants pay more taxes than they consume in public services, meaning immigration in fact burdens Finland's public finance sector. For over a decade, Suomen Perusta Foundation has published extensive studies on this subject by Samuli Salminen, which leave no doubt about the matter. Another constantly repeated justification for immigration is so-called acute labor shortage, which is a laughable excuse in a country with the second worst unemployment in Europe and more than 300,000 unemployed people. These bad excuses are even worse when we think about the effects of migration to safety, social cohesion, and to the eventual consequence that Finns will become minority in their own country if the mass migration is not stopped. Dear audience, the reason behind open borders is that even though many suffer from mass migration, there are also those few who benefit from it. Business interest groups benefit from immigration for two cynical reasons. First, immigration provides cheap labor, helping keep wages down. Second, immigration, like all population growth, increases demand for goods and services, which benefit producers and sellers, but do not taxpayers, since only a small proportion of newcomers are net taxpayers, able to live on their own wages. Big companies get cheap laborers and new consumers, and the taxpayers pay the bill. The political left, meanwhile, has come to support immigration in order to gain more voters, as immigrants represent potential audience for the left-wing political message. So, immigration does not benefit ordinary Finnish taxpayers and workers, who instead suffer from the negative consequences of migration for public finances, Finns' position in the labour market, safety, social stability, and ultimately from the fact that the native population is becoming a minority in its own country. Dear audience, our southern neighbours, Estonians, lost their independence during the Second World War, and under the process of Russification were in the danger of losing their homeland altogether, as the number of Russians grew rapidly in Estonia during the Soviet era. As a result, the country still has a large Russian minority, which makes up much of population of Tallinn and almost all of population of Narva. Our western neighbors, Swedes, have made political mistakes that have led to a demographic development similar to what Estonia suffered during the Cold War occupation. And Finland is rapidly following the same path. Estonians were saved by the collapse of the Soviet Union, which halted the Russification process. Finns and other Europeans, according to surveys, are critical on immigration, but small yet influential interest groups and lobbyists actively driving immigration currently dominate the social debate and political decision-making. To save European societies, we need to raise awareness of the seriousness of the demographic changes caused by immigration and the motives of the pro-immigration lobby. We also need a healthy pride in our own culture and our own roots, without which national survival is not possible. Dear audience, I now invite to the stage Professor Matt Goodwin to tell about the situation in Great Britain. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the warm welcome. It's an absolute delight to be back with you in Finland. I was here last year and I left with very warm memories of the place, and it's great to be back. It's great to be back with the foundation as well. One of your colleagues actually pointed out to me today that there have been people in the past who have come to Finland to discuss politics and then have left and started political revolutions in their home country. And I think he was thinking of Mr. Lenin, Vladimir Lenin. Well, I'm perhaps at the other end of the, well, maybe not quite to the other end of the spectrum, but I do indeed hope to contribute to a political revolution in my country, because goodness knows we need it. As I speak to you today, three things are reshaping the United Kingdom, Britain, and England. Firstly, in party politics, for the first time in a century, a new political party is topping the polls, the national polls. Nigel Farage and the Reform Party last week peaked at 35% of the national vote. They're number one in the national opinion polls, and if that remains true at the next election, they will enter number 10 Downing Street. They will enter government with a commanding parliamentary majority. This is the most significant political insurgency in my country since the rise of the Labour Party in the early 20th century. This is a party that is drawing votes from both the discredited Conservative Party, which morphed into a Liberal Party, and also the Labour Party, which morphed not into a party for the working class, but into a party for the highly educated, socially liberal, if not woke, elite minority. And so electorally, we are in the midst of a political revolution. The second thing that is happening in my country is the people have been taking to the streets. For much of the summer, in dozens of towns and cities, ordinary people, mothers, fathers, grandparents, children, have been protesting against the deliberate and extreme policies of illegal migration, of open borders, and of mass legal migration. They are utterly frustrated with our left-wing Labour government, and they are deeply concerned about the fact that our children are at risk. Since 2018, more than 170,000, mainly young men of fighting age, have entered my country illegally on the small boats, mainly from Islamic nations. And in recent months, we have learned about a series of shocking crimes that have caused a great deal of concern. A 12-year-old schoolgirl in Nuneaton was kidnapped, strangled, and raped by two alleged asylum seekers. A 12-year-old in Birmingham was raped by a Syrian illegal migrant. A 10-year-old girl in Stockport was very nearly kidnapped by an asylum seeker from Sudan. An 8-year-old schoolgirl was raped in Lambeth in London by an asylum seeker from Pakistan. A pensioner named Terence Carney, who liked to go for a walk every morning in the northern town of Hartlepool, was brutally murdered by an asylum seeker from Morocco. And a young British man named Thomas Roberts was brutally murdered by an illegal migrant from Afghanistan when he was on a night out with his friends. I could keep talking to you about these crimes and I'd be here for a long time. Now, the left-wing Labour government says to the British people, if you talk about this, it's misinformation. Everything I've said to you, you can go home tonight, and if you're watching online, you can Google. These are real-world cases. Some good friends of mine who work for a think tank have submitted freedom of information requests to the state to ask how many crimes are being committed by members of different nationalities and according to their immigration status. Because the same state that accuses people of misinformation refuses to give people information about what is happening in their own country. And when we got that information via the Centre for Migration Control, we discovered that the two groups that dominate the small boats that are entering Britain illegally, Afghans and Eritreans, are between 18 and 22 times more likely than British nationals to be arrested for sexual assault and rape. And this is against the backdrop, as you might have also heard, of a national scandal involving the rape gangs, where from the 1970s, organized gangs of primarily Pakistani Muslim men have been preying on young, vulnerable, white, working class girls in dozens of cities and towns, upwards of 85 cities and towns according to one recent inquiry. They gave the girls alcohol, they got them addicted to heroin, and they trafficked them from one town to another. And they were doing this, according to some reports, from as early as the 1960s, yet the elite class in my country did not want to talk about it until 2011, and even then, when people talked about it, they were accused of being Islamophobic, racist, and xenophobes. In fact, even when Elon Musk drew attention to this scandal earlier this year in January, our Labour government still refused to hold a national inquiry to find out the truth about what has been going on in our country. Now, I ask you as a thought experiment, imagine this. Groups of white men had been going into Muslim communities and had been sexually abusing and raping Muslim girls and had been getting them addicted to alcohol and drugs. Do you think for a second the ruling class would have hesitated to get those girls and their families the truth and justice they deserve? For these reasons, people have been taking to the streets to protest. Because for the first time, it feels as though the social contract in my country is collapsing. That people no longer trust the institutions, and they are no longer willing to respect their politicians who have presided over these disasters. And if the protests are a second sign of this growing revolution, I would suggest to you that the third sign has been the way in which, for much of the last 2 months, British and English people have spontaneously been raising flags in their communities, putting Union and St George's flags on lampposts, on public buildings, and even painting roundabouts in the colours of those flags. Sometimes under the cover of darkness, young British men have gone out with ladders and flags, taken down Palestine flags, and replaced them with Union and St George's flags. So much so that even the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, yesterday was asked by the mainstream media as to what he thought about the flags. This has become a genuine, spontaneous, organic, grassroots movement that is an act of resistance. It is a symbolic act of resistance among people who are not only showcasing their pride in the nation, but who are also venting their total opposition to the extreme policies of mass uncontrolled immigration and broken borders. Sir Roger Scruton, an English conservative philosopher, in what is my favourite book, England an Elegy, once said this: "A nation is a home, and like any home, it is a place of safety and belonging, defined by a history and a culture that newcomers must learn to share if they are to belong. Immigration without integration undermines this, for it creates not one home, but many, and eventually no home at all." And I would suggest to you that is what millions of ordinary people in my country are feeling, that their home is being destroyed by a deliberate and reckless policy of mass, uncontrolled immigration that nobody ever voted for. At no general election did a majority of British people give a democratic mandate to this policy. A policy that since the COVID pandemic has added the best part of 5 million people to our country. 5 million people. 81% of all migration into Britain now comes from outside Europe. Just think about that. 81%. of all immigration now comes from outside Europe. India, Pakistan, Nigeria, Uzbekistan, China, Eritrea, Somalia, Sudan, Afghanistan. How do you make a nation out of that? Not just culturally different forms of migration, but I would put it to you, culturally incompatible forms of migration. Now, the expert class, to which I once belonged as a university professor for 20 years, or an academic for 20 years, will tell you this is good for the economy. We just heard two of the arguments. It's good for business, keeps wages low, keeps demand high. Well, if you're a serious member of the expert class, you'll be looking at the evidence. And the evidence tells us something very different. I notice in Finland, we've just had an important new study, which joins studies in Denmark, the Netherlands, and the UK, all of which tell a remarkably consistent story. The exact kind of low-wage, low-skill, poorly educated forms of migration that are now coming into Europe are a net fiscal cost. They take more out of Western economies than they put in. We also know from the UK that the current policy of mass migration is exacerbating what is already one of the worst housing crises we've had in recent history. To give you an example, we have a few million people waiting for social housing, waiting to get on the housing ladder. Last year, our government managed to build somewhere around 180,000 homes in England and Wales. Our net migration rate in recent years has been close to 1 million. How on earth are we ever going to solve a housing crisis and give housing to our young people, which we need to simultaneously help boost the birth rate in our country, because you're not going to have a family if you've got nowhere to live. And our birth rate is now at a record low of 1.4. The replacement level, as many of you will know, is 2.1. So what is happening is our country is being demographically and culturally transformed. Today, more than 1 in 3 of all babies born in England and Wales have mothers who were themselves not born in the country. In England, more than 40% of all babies born last year have at least one parent who was not born in the country. That figure has never been as high. Most of those mothers come from very different countries: India, Pakistan, Nigeria, Bangladesh, Ghana, Afghanistan, and Iraq. In the City of London, 84% of all babies now have at least one foreign-born parent. In Leicester, it's 71%. In Manchester, it's 65%. In Birmingham, it's 62%. In Nottingham, it's 57%. By 2063, white Britons will be a minority in the country overall. By the 2070s, people born overseas and their immediate children will be a majority in the country. And by 2100, according to recent forecasts, 1 in 4 of all people in the UK and closer to 1 in 3 of the under 40s will be following Islam, if we maintain the current direction of travel. 2,000 schools, I should say, in 2,000 schools across the country, a majority of children do not speak English as their first language. In 2,000 schools. There are actually a few schools where not a single child speaks English as their first language. 1 million people, according to the recent census, cannot speak English. And in some areas of the country, around a quarter of people openly reject a British or English identity. To return to Roger Scruton, if you do not have a shared culture, if you do not have a shared identity, if you do not have a shared way of life, and if you do not have a shared sense of collective memory, then you have no nation and you have no home. While we are running this policy, we simultaneously have no strategy for integration. Our politicians used to talk about this word, multiculturalism. Tony Blair used to talk about it. Gordon Brown used to talk about it. But in 2010, David Cameron said multiculturalism has failed. Angela Merkel said multiculturalism has failed. Nicolas Sarkozy said multiculturalism has failed. Since then, nobody even talks about integration in the UK, in Britain, and in England. Nobody even bothers to ask the question, how are we even going to integrate these communities anymore? What we have instead is what I would suggest to you is a policy of two-tier multiculturalism. Two-tier multiculturalism is what happens when the ruling class tell you to celebrate every minority group, every minority identity, every minority culture, every minority way of life, except your own. You cannot celebrate your own identity. You must either suppress your identity or reshape it around the celebration of diversity, the celebration of multiculturalism. But as Francis Fukuyama said in his recent book, Identity, to say that a nation is welcoming of other people is fine. But it is the same thing as saying you have no identity of your own. It is the same thing as saying you have no distinctive identity of your own. And the reason so many people in my country are protesting at the ballot box or on the streets is because they are saying, no, we do have a distinctive identity. We do have a distinctive culture. We do have a distinctive sense of history and collective memory. And we want to protect and promote those things. And if you want a symbol of two-tier multiculturalism that I think really brings it home, it was when a 12-year-old girl went to her school's culture day. And she was really excited about this day, the celebration of cultures. And some of you, like me, have long memories, and you might remember this. And she decided to wear a sparkling Union Jack dress like one of the Spice Girls in the 1990s. She got to school, and they pulled her to one side, and they said, you can't wear that. And they sent her home. That is two-tier multiculturalism. Two-tier multiculturalism is when you allow thousands of people to march through your capital city demonstrating loyalty to the Islamist terrorists, Hamas and Hezbollah, while telling the people of your country they cannot protest about policies that are completely transforming their home and leaving it unrecognizable. Two-tier multiculturalism is when you allow people to sing anti-Semitic songs on the streets of your capital city, and when you throw somebody like Lucy Connolly, a young mother who in the aftermath of the Southport atrocity tweeted something many people will find offensive. She then deleted it a few hours later, and she was sent to prison for the best part of 3 years. Now, she was recently released, I would suggest because of public pressure, but she should not have been put in prison at all. Because she too has become a powerful symbol of what is happening in my country. Another example today, comedian Graham Linehan has stepped off an airplane from America, having sent a few tweets expressing his gender-critical views, expressing his belief that trans women are not women. And he was met with 5 armed police officers who took him to a police station and told him he wasn't allowed to tweet anymore. We have a Labour government introducing a new definition of Islamophobia, which specifically mentioned in its original form that discussing the rape gangs was Islamophobic. A definition of Islamophobia that when it was first formulated just a few years ago said that if you talk about the rape gangs, you could be considered an Islamophobe. That said if you talk about the growth of Islam in Western societies, demographic trends, you could be considered an Islamophobe. And if you talked about Muslim entryism into British politics or the institutions, you could be considered an Islamophobe. Well, we've just discovered that there are organised networks of Muslim activists within our civil service. We've discovered campaign groups like Muslim Votes, which is trying to organise Muslims to vote in the same way at general elections, usually along the lines of Gaza, rather than what's happening in the UK. And we've discovered opinion polling, which suggests between 30 and 40% of British Muslims would like a Muslim-only political party. So if I talk about these things, what on earth would have happened a few years ago if that definition of Islamophobia had become law? No doubt I would be carted off to prison the moment people watch this video, which is streaming live online. That definition is still about to be introduced by this Labour government, which has also expanded something called non-crime hate incidents, which is truly out of the pages of George Orwell. A non-crime hate incident is if you leave this event and on the way home you think, that Matt Goodwin has offended me. He said something deeply offensive, and you call the police. You say, I've just been to a talk, and Matt Goodwin has offended one of my protected characteristics, my race, my gender, my sex. The police will come and visit me, despite you not having to give them any evidence. They will come and visit me, and they will let me know a black mark has been put on my record, and if I go for a job, in the future, my employer might access my records and see, well, this guy's got a non-crime hate incident on his name. He must be a bad apple. Is this the UK, the home of individual liberty and free speech, or is this Soviet Russia? Right? What is this? I don't recognize this country that I'm living in anymore. I don't recognize it. To me, this is totalitarian, authoritarian, and then when I watch our Prime Minister Keir Starmer go to the United States of America earlier this year and sit in the Oval Office with President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance, and he says, we do not have a free speech problem. What we have, I would suggest to you, is a censorship industrial complex that is trying to control the supply of information and the parameters of the national conversation because it is the only thing left they can do, which is try and suppress dissent, try and discredit political opposition, try and delegitimize ideas that are entirely legitimate. Because we saw this after the Southport atrocity last summer, which I think was a trailer for what is to come, whereby in the aftermath of the murder of 3 little girls at a Taylor Swift dance party by the son of Rwandan immigrants, Axel Rudakabana, in the aftermath of that atrocity, it was very obvious to people who had any understanding of our country that the protests and the public reaction were not just about what had unfolded at that dance studio, but were about the deeper question of why the hell are these people in our country anyway? And Keir Starmer's response was, you're far right if you talk about it. If you raise questions, you are far right. Because that apparently now is all the ruling class have left, which is to inflate these terms, inflate these taboos, to expand and morph and change words to try and control the national conversation. That is why we are now heading headlong into a political revolution, because the British and the English people have had enough. And it's not just me who thinks this. If you look at all of the opinion polling in our country, the vast majority of tax-paying, hard-working, law-abiding people are utterly fed up with the status quo. I'll give you one brief example, just to show you how hideously unfair this settlement really is. If you cross over the channel in a small boat and you arrive illegally in our country, you are put in asylum hotels to the cost of £5.7 million every day, which the British taxpayer has to cover. £5.7 million, amid what is one of the worst cost of living crises since the Second World War. But it gets worse. What the government then does is it takes the British people's money, taxpayers' money, and it uses that money as a guarantee so that private companies can offer landlords more favourable contracts to rent out their properties to asylum seekers and illegal migrants who have broken our laws, giving them more favourable tenancies, saying if there's any damage to the property, the British taxpayer will take care of it. They don't have to pay council tax bills. They've got guaranteed rent in order for those landlords to take illegal migrants over the British people. In other words, the British people's own money is being used to outbid the British people in their own housing market by a left-wing party, by a party that talks about fairness and solidarity and working people. Now, if you've been to Britain and England, you'll know that the one thing that basically underpins our entire culture is the notion of fair play, of fairness. It goes all the way back to cricket and queuing. Never jump a queue in my country. These policies are driving a truck through our sense of fairness. That is why people are protesting, because our entire system is now hardwired to reward people who are breaking our laws. It's got to such an absurd point that we have national politicians accusing the people of misinformation, of disinformation, while it was just revealed that for much of the last year, politicians in all of the established parties were secretly importing thousands of people from Afghanistan while gagging the press, not allowing the press to talk about it, not telling the British people about it, giving them the costs of £7 billion to pay for this, and then we're accusing the British people of misinformation. And people were saying, where are these Afghans coming from? And what was happening was, after the disastrous war in Afghanistan, thank you again to the ruling class for 25 years of disasters in the Middle East, they were secretly importing people who claimed that they were at risk of repercussions from the Taliban. And without telling anybody, they just imported all of these people, put them into the heart of our communities, and said to the British taxpayers, you pick up the cost. No democratic mandate, no discussion in Parliament, no scrutiny, no transparency. And then they accuse the people of misinformation. It is absolutely outrageous, completely unjustified. So we have an elite class that is completely adrift from the forgotten majority in my country, which is why Nigel Farage and Reform, as of today, are on 35% of the vote. Now, the ruling class used to say that Mr. Farage could never get above 15% in the national polls, but such is the exasperation and such is the frustration that now the people will, I'm pretty confident, they will make Nigel Farage our next Prime Minister because they are so sick and tired of the consensus in Westminster that has presided over the country for the last 30 years. Big tax, big net zero, big woke, big immigration, broken borders. They're absolutely sick of it. And if we get to the next election, unless we have a major economic collapse before we get there, which is looking increasingly likely, if we get to that next election, we will, hands down, see the most significant political revolt in my country since the rise of Tony Blair and New Labour in 1997, who of course set the foundation for all of this chaos. And at the root of it, Blair said his priority was education, education, education. Well, let me tell you, at the root of the next big political revolution in Britain, it will be immigration, 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 because people have had enough. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much for the lection. You have heard that we have a big problems in the United Kingdom with the immigration and the free speech, but on the other hand, we see that there is hope because there is a lot of people are against it and ready to vote new parties and ready to demonstrate that they are proud of their Britishness. So there is the situation is very, very interesting in Great Britain. And now we have time to take some questions and comments, and Mr. Goodwin will answer them. So raise your hands. So Gary, please come here and ask. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Timo Kallio from Espoo. You're painting a quite of desperate picture of Britain and the future. So, do you have any solution? What do you suggest we should do about this thing? And the second question is I read from the Political this afternoon that you said 35% peak. Well, it's an estimation or average of the polls, so it says 31 or something like that. But what happens, because as I've understood, the next election will be in 2029.
Yeah.
So it's 4 years. Anything can happen.
Well, let me start with the first question, what is to be done? One thing I didn't say at the introduction is I do set out an alternative agenda for Western societies, economies and politics. I have a newsletter, mattgoodwin.org, which is a Substack newsletter, and we have 84,000 readers. And I present an alternative to what we're living through in Western societies. And my alternative for the UK is pretty straightforward. What we need is a factory reset. And the analogy I would use is your smartphone. When your smartphone becomes overloaded with apps, it becomes slow, it becomes sluggish, it becomes a major source of stress. What has happened to our country, and I think many other Western countries, is they have experienced the same. We've added things onto them, we've put apps on, and we've put all these policies on, and our societies and our home has become a major source of stress. A lot of people in my country will say they simply don't like living there anymore. It's not the country they knew, it's managed decline, they don't recognize it. So what do I mean by a factory reset? In my mind, this is about going back, partly, to what was before the Blairite revolution, which started in 1997, and we are now living through the death throes of that revolution with the Keir Starmer regime. So we need to do a number of things that reassert the foundations of our country, make them stronger, and get us back to being a self-governing, independent nation with control over our borders and our own laws. To begin with, we need to leave the European Convention on Human Rights so we can deport foreign criminals and better control our borders. Article 3 and Article 8 are routinely used to keep illegal migrants in our country. We need to join Canada, Australia, America, and much of the Anglosphere and the Commonwealth in being outside of the ECHR. We don't need to be in it. We need to reform, if not repeal, Tony Blair's Human Rights Act, which entrenches the ECHR into domestic law. We need to detain and deport all illegal migrants and process them offshore, away from the British people, outside of British communities. We then need to get to work at looking at how we can better integrate people who are already in our country. And there are lots of things we can do around English language tuition and making life very difficult for people who do not speak English. We can start to remove translation services from public institutions. We can start doing things that make it clear we are a country of equality before the law and where the common law tradition was dominant. We have 80 to 85 Sharia courts in the UK. Sorry, those should not exist in the UK. We don't have parallel legal systems in our society. We don't even teach our children in schools about the foundation of our civilization, about who we are, about our history. We don't do it properly. We don't do it in a balanced way. But I start with ending the policy of mass uncontrolled immigration. Overwhelmingly, that is the priority. Let me give you one example. People say, well, this is all too difficult. Rubbish. Everything you see that has caused the chaos and the carnage that we live in today was a specific political choice. It was a specific political choice. Tony Blair's advisors have written about why they started mass migration, and they said it was to rub the right's nose in diversity. It was a deliberate political choice. We need to make a different political choice, which is we end that policy. We have nearly 10 million Brits on working age benefits. We have 1 million young Brits not in education, employment or training. That is an outrage to have that many young people sitting at home not doing anything. And what we're doing, to go back to the opening remarks, is we are using mass migration to cover that up. We're flooding the country with cheap labour from Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria, while leaving nearly 10 million of our own people sitting on the welfare state. That is absolutely insane. Doesn't make any sense to me and to many people. So we can start making better choices. Give you another example. National Health Service. We reject thousands of British kids every year from becoming doctors and medical professionals, and they're straight A students, and we reject them. We say, we don't have places for you in medical schools. And at the same time, we take lower quality doctors and medical professionals from Ghana and Nepal and India. Why? Because it's cheaper. That's an example of a policy that is outrageous. If you're a young British person and you want to become a doctor or a medical professional, we should pay for that. We should contribute to that. And if people say, well, you know, we'll do all that and it'll be expensive and they'll leave to Australia, well, give them more incentives to stay. Give them better, you know, reasons to, if you go through the National Health Service and you train to become a doctor and we invest in you, we'll give you a lot more incentives to stay in our country, discounted mortgage rates, whatever, lower tax rates. We need to start thinking outside the box. And time again, what Westminster does is it says, no, mass immigration, we'll just use that. Pull the mass immigration lever. We've got a social care system in complete crisis because we don't pay people enough. And so people just say, well, pull the mass immigration lever. We'll just get some more Somalis, or we'll get some more Nigerians, or we'll get some more people over from the Philippines, rather than fix the underlying problem. So there's a long list of policies, and I put them all out there: how to fix a free speech crisis, how to fix a broken economy. It's all in the newsletter, you can read it. But what I'm trying to say to you is there is a positive, optimistic alternative to this failing policy of mass migration. And sorry, the second question was not what can you do about...
It's 4 years.
Yeah, what can you do about it, but it's 4 years is a long time. Well, it depends who you listen to. There are some people in Westminster who say the election will come a lot sooner. and there are some people in the markets who say potentially things will start to unravel this winter. It's not hard to see some kind of market collapse. I think we started potentially to see some of that today. The 30-year gilt yield this morning went up to 5.6, which is the highest that we've had since 1998. The markets clearly do not have confidence in this Labour government. They could quite easily bring down Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, our Chancellor, much in the same way that the markets brought down Liz Truss. That would then plunge the Labour Party into chaos. The Labour Party may then, who knows, lurch to the left. That would create further turmoil and there would be a collapse of confidence in the government. I suspect, because of the way our political system works, is that it will be very, very difficult to dislodge Labour until the next general election. So in that time, people who want an alternative have no other option but to build one and to set the stage for one. The useful analogy would be the 1990s. Under the Conservatives, it was pretty clear for much of John Major's government that we were heading into a new zeitgeist, with Tony Blair and New Labour dominating the polls, much like Nigel Farage and Reform are dominating the opinion polls today. And I think that's what we are living through in the West, which probably began with Donald Trump's re-election, is the rise of a new zeitgeist, which we might loosely say is one that is organised around national preference. We're going to put our people first, and we're not going to allow Western civilization to be deconstructed and to be repudiated to this degree. So, you know, fingers crossed. Maybe it comes sooner, but my gut instinct is, you know, we've got 3-4 years of chaos before we get there.
Quite simply, why did the Conservatives give up? Is there any life in the party anymore?
Well, the Conservative Party is in a death spiral. Obviously, one book that I think everybody probably has read or will know of is a book that every student is told to read in their politics degree, which is The Strange Death of Liberal England. And we are living through the strange death of the Tory party, largely because of specific choices taken by the Tory party. It was Boris Johnson who set the stage for the destruction, and I don't use that word loosely, the destruction of our country. It was Boris Johnson who presided over what we now call in our country the Boris wave. He came into power in 2019 with a very specific mandate from the British people: get us out of the European Union and lower the overall numbers of migrants. That was his manifesto pledge. That was his promise to the British people. What Boris Johnson did instead is, yes, he got us out of the European Union, but he then put immigration on steroids. In fact, even worse. Boris Johnson removed the requirement for British companies to advertise jobs in Britain first before advertising jobs overseas. And he calls himself a conservative. Boris Johnson was never a conservative, like much of the Tory parliamentary party is not conservative. They are liberal bohemians who are more interested in their own social status than the country. That's a reality. It is a Westminster set that is preoccupied with how other people perceive them at dinner parties. That's why he did it. He wanted to be liked, like when he was Mayor of London. He just wanted people to like him. Unfortunately, he sold the country down the river at the same time because he opened the gates to masses of low-wage, low-skill migration from outside of Europe. And the Tories now, on 16% of the vote, it's game over. It's game over. There's no comeback story here. There's no compelling end to this saga where somebody rises from the ashes. What's going to happen is Reform is going to continue to eat away at the Conservative Party electorate. They will be reduced to a rump in the House of Commons at the next general election, and we will reshape conservatism so it isn't liberal, but it is conservative. And that is what you've seen with Donald Trump. That is what you're seeing in many other Western societies. And I think ultimately national conservatism is probably the only thing that can meet the challenges that we face at the moment, which is a rampant hyperliberalism, which wants to deconstruct every barrier and guardrail in society that wants to tell us a man could become a woman and a woman could become a man, that wants to say the nation's not important, the family's not important, that wants the state to basically sanction suicide in hospitals or euthanasia, that has just voted in our country to allow the termination of babies. You know, a radical, relentless social liberalism that has no respect for boundaries and guardrails in society, and a growing threat from Islamism, from an ideology that is deeply hierarchical, is incredibly motivated, and is overwhelmingly focused at taking over communities and countries. And I ultimately think national conservatism is the only thing that is potentially strong enough to push back against both of those things.
Hi, Tuomas Outala from Helsinki. We've seen these like pro-Hamas Palestine protests getting a bit out of hand in the UK and everywhere else for the matter, meaning violent and they're trashing and looting. UK is the promised land of CCTV. Are people being arrested for trashing the cities, or are the CCTV monitoring in the UK being just used for persecuting, you know, English people?
Well, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because for much of the last year and a half, many people have sensed hypocrisy in the management of protests and riots. If you are voicing your allegiance with Hamas, you can apparently march through the capital city on a weekly basis, and there don't appear to be many serious consequences. But if, as we saw just this week, you fly the flag from a council building, you're issued with what's called a Section 4 notice, and you're held off to the local police station to diffuse community tension. Many people feel that there has been a politicization of policing and the justice system in our country. We recently, and some people would say that's perception, it's hard to take that argument seriously when we've had, for example, evidence of the Sentencing Council, which is a sort of advisory body, that has looked to tell judges in our country that they should give more lenient sentences to minority groups, that they should take into account the fact that somebody belongs to a minority, racial, sexual, or gender group when sentencing them. That was actually in the guidance. And it took the Justice Secretary to intervene and stop that from happening. And then people say, we don't live in a two-tier society. I'm afraid to say we do live in a society that is dominated by an ideology that is inherently two-tier, because it views the majority with suspicion, if not disdain. The other example yesterday was a research council funded a report into the British countryside, which is also a very important symbol of our national identity. And I'm writing about it this week in the newsletter because it's a nice symbol of this ideology. It argued that the British countryside is overwhelmingly white, which is a problem, is characterized by crude whiteness, should make spaces for halal food and space to pray, and warned, we'll think about this later when we're in one, that the pub is a monoculture that is exclusionary to minorities. These people hate who we are. It's that simple. It's anti-white racism. We are talked about in a way that they would never talk about any other group. I mean, could you imagine me writing, as an academic, a research report on Tower Hamlets in East London and saying, the problem with Tower Hamlets is it's too black. It's too black. There's too much blackness in Tower Hamlets, and The mosques are monocultural. They don't make enough space for non-Muslims. And I can't get my pint of beer, and I can't get my traditional fish and chips. Could you imagine me ever writing that? It's unbelievable. It's completely politicized. So the universities, and I wrote a book last year about the universities, and we discussed it on the podcast earlier on this afternoon. The universities, also to go back to the question of what is to be done, no taxpayer funding should go on research projects that are openly pushing an anti-Western, anti-British ideology. Now, that's not to say self-criticism should be curtailed. I embrace self-criticism. But again, to go back to Scruton, we're not dealing with self-criticism. We're dealing with self-hatred. We're dealing with a culture of repudiation, which is not about healthy criticism. It is an ideology, post-colonial theory, critical race theory, that is fundamentally rooted in repudiating the West, everything that the West has created. So we need to be clear with what we're dealing with. So that has a whole host of implications in policy terms for what research councils we fund, what the criteria is, how we manage university appointments. And I wrote about this in the book. I'll just give you one minor example so it can make it real. If you apply for an academic job in the UK, if you apply for a research grant in the UK, the first thing you have to do is submit something called a diversity statement, which is a page of A4. And on that page of A4, you would have to tell the university how your research and your teaching contributes to diversity, equality, and inclusion. Right? What's the problem with that, you might ask? The problem with that is it is a politically motivated litmus test that is designed to weed out gender-critical and conservative scholars. Because if I submitted a page of A4 and I said, you know what, I don't actually think we should be asking people how their teaching and research is supporting a political project. I believe universities should be there to pursue truth, the scientific method, objective inquiry, and broadly defined values of the Enlightenment. I don't think they should be this clearly political. But that is happening everywhere. And it is an example of how the system is rigged in favor of one side of the political debate. I cannot tell you how many emails I get from young, gender-critical, conservative scholars who are very aware that they cannot speak their minds because they will not get research grants, they will not get promoted, they will not be taken seriously in their institutions. I didn't say anything controversial until I was a university professor with tenure. And then most of my colleagues made it known pretty quickly that they would rather I was not in the department, okay? But it's a very, very sad state of affairs, and it goes back to the question of what is to be done, and there are lots of things we could get done. I can see some academics in the room, I suspect, nodding along, saying, yeah, I can relate to that.
My name is Juha Mäkelä. I come from Helsinki. That's a great place. Self-criticism, that was a key word. That's the question I had. The ideology of the so-called liberal Democrats, liberal democracy. I have never noticed any self-criticism inside liberal democracy. And if they don't have self-criticism, it's the same as this conservative Soviet communist ideology. Like you said, it wants to swallow everything, suppresses everybody, and it just bursts and collapses. That's the way how liberal democracy will collapse. No, liberal democracy. You as a scholar, have you noticed any liberal democracy? Any self-criticism inside liberal democracy? Among liberal?
Yeah. Well, what I've noticed, from 20 years in universities is a lot of people who describe themselves as the most open-minded and enlightened of all, who happen to be the most closed-minded people I think I've ever met, and also deeply politically intolerant, which we experienced firsthand in the UK after the Brexit vote. I mean, what unfolded after the vote to leave the European Union was nothing short of a national campaign of bullying, of harassment, of intimidation, of Brexit supporters. I was there. I was in the rooms. It was unbelievable the way, it was almost as if the people who run the country were talking about the rest of the country in a highly derogatory way, not realizing that the rest of the country were in the room with them and could hear the insults and the disparaging remarks. And it took my mind, you know, I reviewed this in the newsletter as a new book by a psychologist called Luke Conway, and the book's title, slightly provocative, but it's called Liberal Bullies. And what Conway did is very interesting. There was a guy in the 80s called Bob Altmaier, who became the leading expert on authoritarianism. And he looked at right-wing authoritarianism, and he came up with a scale to measure it. And when he used that scale on people on the left, he said, oh, there is no authoritarianism here. Basically, the left are fine, conservatives are the problem. And for 50, 60 years, Bob Altmaier, you know, became a really big name, published lots of articles. And what Luke Conway did, and I'm very grateful that he did it, is he went back and he looked at the scale and he saw that it was biased, it was rigged. So that the terms he was using when he was asking conservatives were actually different from the terms that he was using when he was asking liberals. So what Luke Conway did is he adjusted the scale and he made it the same on both sides. And he said, let's look at this fairly. And what he found was that within the left, within the liberal left, there is a section, a group of people that are more authoritarian, more dogmatic, are more prone to binary thinking, to black or white thinking, than anybody on the right. And he said they're off the charts. Dogmatic, intolerant, aggressive, hostile. And I was reading the book and it was like, you know, a light bulb moment. He's a serious scholar, lots of citations, top psychologist. And I suddenly started looking around the national debate in the UK at the prominent journalists and thinking, well, you're one of these people, because it just completely made sense that there is, and many of us, you know, what I'm saying maybe won't be a revelation to some of you. I'm sure you have all experienced this possibly in your lives. But there is a group on the left that will not take any criticism at all, will show no willingness to compromise, will never view alternative views as being legitimate. And again, we've seen this over Brexit, and we are now seeing it over the ECHR. Exactly the same arguments. If we leave the European Union, there will be World War III. If we leave the European Convention on Human Rights, we'll become like Belarus. This kind of catastrophizing, this endless, over-the-top return to the 1930s. You know, this radicalization of liberalism whereby liberals can never really make sense of any criticism unless they somehow bring in Adolf Hitler. You know, it's that sort of instinctive reflex. And I can see the writing on the wall here, because much like the Brexit debate, they're going to lose this debate over the ECHR. They're going to lose it heavily, because whenever you put in front of a question to control your country, to control your borders, do you want to do X? The priority for most people is they want their home to feel secure, they want their home to feel safe, and they want their home to be recognizable. And if you frame these questions along those lines, you will win every single time. And I think the left know that deep down, which is why they are so hysterical and apocalyptic, because they can't seem to operate on any other level. So the self-criticism isn't there at all. But I would urge you, I mean, I've summarized all of Conway's findings on the newsletter, so you don't have to read the whole book, but the book itself is a revelation.
And it's been translated into Finnish,
And
your article on Conway.
And it's been translated into Finnish, the article on Conway, which the Foundation has shared and can share again.
Has there been any change in the public debate concerning immigration? Like in Finland, for example, from the mainstream media, you hear only pro-immigration voices. How is the situation in the UK?
Has the public debate over immigration changed in the UK? It is changing day by day. All of the polling from respected pollsters like YouGov and others shows that the British have never been as sceptical of immigration as they are today. I think Finland is an interesting comparison. My message from the UK would be there's a lag, right? I feel as though people like me and others that we won the immigration argument 3 years ago. You know, all the evidence that was coming out was so clear and overwhelming. And I feel as though intellectually we'd won the argument 2 or 3 years ago. There's a lag with the public. And then when the public begin to become aware of the real world effects, they start to change too. And we've seen that dramatically in the UK. You know, they don't think the government's doing a good job. They don't think immigration has been good for our culture and economy. They think immigration has been way too high for the last 10 years. And also, crucially, they think all of that despite also telling pollsters they don't know how high immigration is. So our net migration levels recently have been 700,000 a year, meaning 700,000 more people are coming into the country than are leaving every year. I mean, that's enormous. It's an enormous number. But when you ask the British people how many people are coming, they think it's 70,000. So despite thinking it's 70,000, they're still becoming more sceptical of immigration. So if you constantly tell them, no, these are the numbers, so how do you tell them? Which is the second point. For the first time in recent political history, we have a countercultural ecosystem that I would argue is just as powerful as legacy media. So we have things like YouTube channels, Facebook pages, Substack newsletters. I'll give you an example. I mean, just to give my own life experience. You know, last month we had 25 million people visit our Facebook page. We had 40 million people visit us on Twitter X, and we have about 2 million people who read the newsletter every month, okay? Smallish numbers relative to the BBC, but significant. But now, stand back and look at all the other things. So, you know, all the other YouTube channels, all the other Substacks, all the other podcasts, the new universities. There's an ecosystem that is now emerging which is openly countercultural. I would argue is responsible. It's not extreme. It's not outside the realm of, you know, broad commitment to democracy, you know, commitment to the rule of law, you know, all of that. But is making the argument against this elite class. And their strategy at the moment appears to be, we're just going to ignore this and hope it goes away. But it's not going to go away. It's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So if you can communicate these arguments to people in a very snappy, quick way, using social media, you know, you can change a lot of people's minds quite quickly, especially if you're doing so with evidence, with information. You know, we've exposed a lot of stuff within the UK state. We told people a lot of things that they didn't know previously by submitting, friends of mine, submitting freedom of information requests and so on. And it also raises a difficult question of, well, why are independent campaigners having to do that? If the state is so confident about its mission, if it thinks this is the right thing to do, why is the state not releasing this information? Why are politicians not giving people this information? And I think that's a question that hopefully many people will start to ask. I mean, we know why, but hopefully that's a question they'll start to ask.
Have you still any questions? If not, then it's time to thank Mr. Woodkin for excellent.
Thank you.